Chapter 1. The Burden of Hearing. The dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light, a silent, swirling cosmos in the stale air of the rectory office. Father Julian Finch watched them, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Each particle represented a secret he carried, a whispered sin entrusted to him in the dark warmth of the confessional. For 30 years he had been a vessel, a sacred container for the town's quiet desperation. But the vessel was cracking. The weight of it all pressed down, a physical pressure behind his eyes, a permanent ache in his shoulders. His cassock hung on him, a size too large now, its black fabric a testament to a faith that felt increasingly threadbare. The office was a study in beige and brown. A crucifix, stripped of ornamentation, hung on the wall opposite his desk. Its severe lines offered little comfort. Books on theology and church history lined the shelves, their spines uncracked for years. They were monuments to a time when answers were simpler, when the world could be neatly divided into light and shadow. Julian's world was now a perpetual, suffocating gray. He ran a hand over his face, the rasp of his stubble loud in the quiet room. Sleep offered no escape, only fractured dreams of whispers and water. His thoughts drifted, as they always did, to Agnes Gable. She had died 3 weeks ago. Her passing was not a tragedy. She was 92 and her heart had simply stopped. The horror was in her final confession. Julian had visited her in the sterile, antiseptic room of the nursing home. The air smelled of bleach and regret. Agnes, a woman he had known his entire life as a pillar of the church, had unburdened herself. It was not a confession. It was an autopsy of a soul steeped in venom. She spoke for 2 hours, her voice a dry rattle. She detailed a lifetime of petty cruelties, of gleeful slander that ruined reputations, of envy so potent it soured the milk in her own refrigerator. She confessed to poisoning a neighbor's prize-winning roses, to spreading a rumor that broke a young couple's engagement in 1958, to stealing small, sentimental items from friends who trusted her. The sins were small, pathetic even, but their volume was staggering. A deluge of malice. Julian had sat there holding her thin, cold hand, the sacrament turning to ash in his mouth. He granted her absolution, the words mechanical, empty. He felt like a liar. Her soul was a cesspool, and he had been forced to drink from it. Since then, the whispers had grown louder. Not real whispers, not yet. They were the echoes in his own mind, the ghost pains of sins he had not committed but was forced to carry. Agnes's confession had been the final stone placed on an already overloaded cart. The axles were screaming. A sharp rap on the office door jolted him. He straightened his spine, composing his features into a mask of placid reverence. "Come in." The door opened and Deputy Cora Martinez stepped inside. She took off her wide-brimmed hat, revealing dark hair pulled into a severe bun. Her uniform was immaculate, the creases sharp. She moved with a purpose that seemed to suck the lazy stillness from the room. Cora was a creature of logic and procedure. She had grown up here, a child of pragmatic farmers, and her faith extended only to what she could see, touch, and write down in an official report. "Father," she said. Her voice was level, betraying no emotion. She did not call him Julian, not since her mother's funeral 5 years ago. "Cora, to what do I owe the visit? I trust the town is behaving itself." He gestured to the worn armchair opposite his desk. She ignored the chair, choosing to stand. It was not a visit of courtesy. "I came to check on you. Martha from the bake sale committee said you missed the planning meeting this morning. Said you haven't been answering your phone." Julian offered a thin smile. "My apologies, I was occupied with study." The lie felt clumsy on his tongue. He had spent the morning staring at the dust motes. Cora's eyes scanned the room, missing nothing. They lingered on the untouched stack of mail on his desk, the fine layer of dust on the telephone. "Your study appears to be collecting more dust than you are." She crossed her arms. "People are talking, Father. They say you seem distant, tired." "The flock is always concerned. It is their nature." "It's my nature to be concerned when our town's spiritual leader starts looking like a ghost." Her gaze was unwavering. "I'm not here as a parishioner. I'm here because you are a citizen of this county and you appear to be unwell. Is everything all right?" He wanted to tell her. He wanted to unburden himself, to pour out the decades of accumulated filth, to tell her about Agnes and the whispers and the weight. But how could he explain it? It was the central pillar of his calling. The seal of the confessional was absolute. He was a locked room, and the contents were rotting from within. "I am merely tired, Cora. The work of the Spirit is draining." She did not seem convinced. She walked to the window, peering out past the manicured lawn of the church towards the dark, jagged line of trees on the horizon. The weeping mangrove. From here, it was just a smudge of deep green and black, a place where the neat grid of farmland and county roads simply stopped. "Are you sleeping?" she asked, her back to him. "As well as can be expected. My grandfather used to tell stories about that place," she said, nodding towards the mangrove. "He said it was a place for things that were best forgotten, a place of judgment. He was a superstitious old fool, but he never went near it." Julian followed her gaze. The mangrove. Local legends clung to it like moss. They said the trees wept a red sap like blood. They said the maze of waterways and roots would shift and change, trapping the unwary. They said it was a place of penance where a person's sins were given form and substance. He had always dismissed the tales as folk nonsense, cautionary stories to keep children from wandering into the swamp. Now the idea held a strange, terrifying appeal, a place of judgment, a place where sins were given form. Perhaps a sin made real could be fought. Perhaps it could be defeated. "Folk tales," Julian said, his voice quiet. "Stories to frighten children." Cora turned from the window. "Maybe. Or maybe some places are just bad ground. We get calls about it every few years. A lost hiker, a hunter who doesn't come home. We find their car parked at the edge, but we never find them. The ground is too soft for tracks and the terrain is impossible." She took a step towards his desk. "Stay away from it, Father. Whatever is bothering you, the answer is not in there." The warning had the opposite effect. An idea, cold and sharp, began to form in Julian's mind. It was a desperate, irrational idea born of exhaustion and spiritual agony. If he could not unburden himself through prayer, perhaps he could be scoured clean by something more primal. If God would not answer him, perhaps the bad ground would. "I appreciate your concern, Cora," he said, his voice taking on a new resolve. "Truly, but I am fine, just overworked." She held his gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills. Her expression was a mixture of professional duty and something else, something softer. Pity, perhaps. She was the first person to pierce his facade in a long time. Finally, she nodded, a short, sharp gesture of defeat. "All right, Father, but my phone is on 24/7 if you need anything, anything at all." She placed her hat back on her head, the motion crisp and final. "Don't make me come looking for you." She left, closing the door softly behind her. The silence she left in her wake was heavier than before. Julian stood and walked to the window, looking out at the distant mangrove. Cora's warning echoed in his mind, but it was drowned out by a stronger, more insistent thought, a place of judgment. He was a man carrying the sins of 100 souls, with no way to put them down. The thought of entering that primeval place, of facing a tangible consequence, was terrifying. But it was less terrifying than the prospect of another 30 years of this slow, silent decay. He thought of Agnes Gable's litany of poison, of the rapist who confessed and walked away free, of the thief whose guilt he now carried as his own. He was their landfill. That evening he did not eat. He showered, the hot water doing little to wash away the grime he perceived on his soul. He dressed not in his cassock, but in simple, sturdy trousers, a dark shirt, and walking boots. He packed a small canvas bag, a bottle of water, a compass he hadn't used in years, a rosary with smooth, worn beads, and a small, leather-bound Bible. It felt like preparing for an exorcism of himself. He stood at the back door of the rectory, the cool night air raising goosebumps on his arms. The moon was a pale sliver, offering little light. In the distance, the weeping mangrove was a maw of absolute blackness. He could hear the faint, rhythmic chirping of crickets, a sound that seemed to stop at the forest's edge. He thought of Cora's practical, worried face. He thought of his vows, of the sanctity of the soul. Then he thought of the whispers, the endless, churning whispers. He took a step off the stone path and onto the damp grass. Then another. He did not look back at the church, a silent, sleeping giant behind him. His shadow stretched long and thin before him, pointing the way. He walked towards the darkness, a pilgrim on an unholy journey, seeking not salvation but a reckoning. Chapter 2. The Bleeding Trees. The transition from manicured farmland to the mangrove's edge was unnervingly abrupt. One moment, Julian walked on solid earth, the scent of cut grass and damp soil in his nostrils. The next, the ground became soft and yielding, and the air grew thick, heavy with the smells of salt, rot, and something else, a coppery, metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. The neat rows of corn gave way to a chaotic wall of vegetation. Twisted trees with pale, gray bark grew in dense thickets, their roots exposed and tangled like nests of writhing serpents. He found a narrow opening, little more than a game trail, and pushed his way through. The branches, slick with moisture, clawed at his shirt and scraped against his skin. Within 20 feet, the sounds of the open world, the distant hum of the highway, the chirping of crickets, vanished, swallowed by a profound, oppressive silence. The canopy of leaves overhead was so dense it blotted out the sliver of moon and the stars. He was plunged into a disorienting darkness, relieved only by the weak beam of the small flashlight he had brought. The beam cut a nervous, bouncing circle of light on the path ahead. The ground was a treacherous soup of black mud, slick leaves, and submerged roots that seemed placed to trip him. The air was still and hot, and sweat soon soaked his shirt, plastering it to his skin. The only sound was his own ragged breathing and the squelch of his boots in the mire. He pressed on, guided by the compass and a foolish sense of purpose. The idea that had seemed so clear in the sterile quiet of his office now felt like the ramblings of a madman. What was he doing here? What did he expect to find? A monster to slay, a demon to exorcise. The absurdity of it washed over him, a cold counterpoint to the sweltering heat. He stopped, leaning against the trunk of a large tree to catch his breath. He shone his light upwards. The bark was smooth and strangely pale. From cracks and fissures in its surface, a thick, dark liquid oozed, running down the trunk in sluggish rivulets. He reached out a hesitant finger and touched it. It was viscous and warm. When he brought his finger to the light, it was coated in a substance the color of dark, venous blood. He recoiled, wiping his hand furiously on his trousers. The coppery smell was stronger here. The weeping trees, the legends were real. A wave of nausea and vertigo swept over him. The forest was not merely a collection of plants. It felt like a single, living organism, and he was an intruder in its vascular system. He pushed away from the tree and stumbled onward, a new urgency in his steps. The desire for penance was rapidly being replaced by a primal need to escape. He checked his compass. He had been walking for what felt like hours, yet the needle insisted he had barely made a quarter mile. The whispers began subtly. At first, he dismissed them as the rustling of leaves or the buzzing of insects in the humid air. But they grew more distinct, coalescing at the very edge of his hearing. They were not in his head anymore. They were outside, slithering through the tangled branches, rising from the bubbling mud. They were sibilant, dry sounds like papers scraping against a stone floor. He froze, straining to listen. The whispers were a chorus, dozens of them, all speaking at once. He could not make out individual words, but he recognized the cadence. It was the hurried, furtive rhythm of the confessional. He was listening to a congregation of secrets. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the fog of his exhaustion. This was impossible. It was a hallucination, a product of his overwrought mind and the disorienting environment. He squeezed his eyes shut and gripped the rosary in his pocket, his thumb rubbing furiously over the smooth, worn beads. He began to recite the Lord's Prayer, his voice a desperate, trembling whisper that was immediately swallowed by the immense silence of the mangrove. When he opened his eyes, the whispers were louder. He could begin to pick out fragments, phrases spoken in familiar voices. I never told him the child wasn't his, a woman's voice laced with shame. He took the money from the collection plate just a little at a time, a man's gruff mutter. I prayed for my sister's illness, but I was glad when she... Another voice choked with self-loathing. These were the voices of his parishioners, the secrets he had absorbed week after week. The mangrove was drawing them out of him, giving them voice in the suffocating air. He clapped his hands over his ears, but it did no good. The whispers seemed to bypass his ears and bore directly into his skull. He began to run. He abandoned any pretense of following a path, crashing blindly through the undergrowth. Thorns tore at his clothes and his skin. Low-hanging vines whipped at his face. He stumbled, fell to his knees in the slick mud, and scrambled back to his feet, gasping for breath. The flashlight beam sliced wildly through the darkness, illuminating a hellish landscape of bleeding trees and grasping roots. The chorus of whispers grew, but one voice began to cut through the others. It was thin, reedy, and full of a spiteful energy that was unmistakable. Agnes Gable. I told everyone Martha's boy was a deviant, saw him myself, a filthy little creature. And swapped the sugar for salt at the bake sale, watched their faces pucker with disgust. Oh, the joy of it. And hope she rots, the sanctimonious cow, with her perfect garden and her doting husband. It was her final confession, replayed for him in the theater of the swamp. Every petty cruelty, every venomous thought echoed around him. The air grew thick with the psychic stench of her soul. He felt a profound, suffocating defilement, as if the mud he was running through was the physical manifestation of her sin. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs were heavy as lead. He burst through a curtain of hanging moss and found himself in a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a single, stunted cypress tree, its base wider than a man was tall. It was old, ancient even. Its bark was gnarled and knotted into shapes that resembled contorted human faces. It did not bleed like the other trees. It was dry and dead. Panting, Julian leaned against the tree, his body trembling with exertion and terror. The whispers seemed fainter here, as if the dead cypress offered some small sanctuary. He fumbled in his bag for his water bottle, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unscrew the cap. He drank deeply, the tepid water tasting of plastic and salvation. As his breathing returned to normal, he became aware of a new sound. It was not a whisper. It was a soft, rhythmic chittering, accompanied by a wet, scraping noise. It came from all around him, from the base of the dead tree, from the dark mud of the clearing. He swept the flashlight beam across the ground. At first, he saw nothing but mud and leaf litter. Then a patch of debris moved. He focused the light on it. It was not debris. It was a creature the size of his fist. Its body was a horrid amalgamation of mud, twigs, and decaying leaves, held together by a thick, mucus-like substance. It had too many legs, thin and spindly like a spider's, and they scraped against the ground as it moved. Then he saw its mouth. Where a normal insect would have a mandible or a proboscis, this thing had a pair of soft, wet, perfectly formed human lips. They moved constantly, shaping silent words. Another creature crawled into the light, then another and another. The clearing was alive with them. Dozens, hundreds. They emerged from the mud, their spindly legs scuttling, their grotesque mouths working silently. They were the source of the whispers. They were giving voice to Agnes Gable's confession. A wave of revulsion so powerful it made him gag washed over Julian. These things were unnatural, an abomination. He took a staggering step away from the tree, his boots sinking into the soft mud. The movement drew their attention. In unison, 100 pairs of lips stopped moving. 100 tiny, unseen heads swiveled towards him. The silence was somehow more terrifying than the whispers. The creatures were utterly still, a silent, waiting army. Then, as one, they began to crawl towards him. Their pace was slow, deliberate, a relentless advance. Julian turned to flee, but a new sound stopped him. One of the creatures, closer than the others, had opened its mouth, and from it, In the perfect, reedy voice of Agnes Gable came a single, clear word. "Priest!" He screamed. It was not a prayer or a word, just a raw animal sound of pure terror. He scrambled backwards, falling into the mud. The creatures swarmed forward, their pace quickening. They crawled over his boots, up his legs, their touch shockingly cold and damp. He could hear their whispers coalesce into a single, hateful tirade. Agnes's voice multiplied 100-fold, drilling into his mind. He kicked and thrashed, trying to dislodge them, his hands smacking against their soft, yielding bodies. Night had fallen completely. The darkness in the mangrove was absolute. He was alone, unarmed, and being consumed by a tide of filth. The weak beam of his flashlight dropped in the mud, cast long, monstrous shadows that danced and writhed. He was going to die here, drowned in the sins of another, a fittingly absurd end for a priest who had lost his way. The thought was his last coherent one before the sheer, gibbering panic took over completely. Chapter 3: The Murmur Mites. The things crawled over him, a tide of living filth. Julian thrashed in the mud, a primal scream tearing from his throat. Their touch was a violation, cold and cloying through the fabric of his trousers. He could feel the fine, sharp points of their twig-like legs, the soft pressure of their bodies. The air was thick with the cacophony of Agnes Gable's voice, 100 tiny mouths whispering her litany of hate. They were on his chest, his arms. One scuttled across his cheek, its human-like lips brushing against his skin. A shudder of pure revulsion racked his body. He swiped at it, his hand connecting with its soft, yielding form. It came away smeared with mud and a foul, sticky mucus. He rolled onto his stomach, trying to crush them, to grind them into the mire. The movement only seemed to spur them on. They were single-minded, relentless. They were not trying to bite him, not trying to sting. They were crawling upwards towards his head, towards his ears. He understood their purpose with a flash of chilling clarity. They wanted to whisper directly into him, to pour their borrowed poison into the very seat of his consciousness. The horror of the idea gave him a surge of adrenaline. He got his hands under him and pushed himself up, lurching to his feet like a newborn colt. He swatted furiously at his own body, knocking the creatures away. They fell into the mud with soft, wet plops, only to reorient themselves and begin their slow, inexorable advance again. His flashlight lay half-submerged in the muck, its beam painting a sickly yellow cone on the weeping trees. He scrambled for it, his fingers closing around the metal casing. He shone it on the swarm. They paused, seeming to recoil from the direct light. A weapon. It was a meager one, but it was something. He backed away, keeping the beam trained on the thickest part of the swarm. They flowed around the edges of the light, trying to flank him. He was a lighthouse keeper on a tiny island, surrounded by a chittering, whispering sea. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit," he began, his voice cracking. The words felt hollow, a child's bedtime prayer against the monsters under the bed. The creatures paused. The whispering faltered for a second. Had it worked? Was his faith, however frayed, still a shield? He pressed on, his voice gaining a desperate strength. "Deliver us from evil. Defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil." He recited the prayer to Saint Michael, the words coming automatically from decades of repetition. The swarm pulled back, a tangible retreat of several inches. The whispering descended into a confused, agitated hiss. It was working. The words, the intent behind them, had power here. He was not just a man in a swamp. He was a priest, an ordained vessel of a power these things recognized, a power they abhorred. A sliver of hope cut through his terror. He was not helpless. He took a step forward, sweeping the flashlight beam like a sword, the words of the prayer a battle cry on his lips. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray, and do thou, O Prince of the heavenly hosts, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits. The creatures scattered, melting back into the mud and shadows at the edge of the clearing. The hateful chorus of whispers faded, replaced once more by the oppressive, waiting silence of the mangrove. Julian stood alone in the clearing, panting, his body trembling, covered in mud and mucus. He was alive. He was alone. The silence that followed was a different kind of terror. The immediate threat was gone, but the knowledge of what lived in this place was now seared into his mind. He leaned against the dead cypress, his legs threatening to give out. He had a name for them now, a name that came unbidden to his mind. The murmur mites. They were sin made flesh, carriers of confession, and they had been drawn to him. He was a beacon, a walking feast of spiritual decay. He had to get out. Not later, not in the morning. Now. Survival had supplanted penance as his sole motivation. He checked his compass, his hands still shaking. North. He had to go north. He took a hesitant step out of the relative safety of the clearing and back into the dense, tangled trees. He moved with excruciating slowness, sweeping the flashlight beam in frantic arcs, his ears straining for any sound of chittering. Every rustle of leaves, every drip of sap, sent a fresh jolt of fear through him. The whispers were gone, but the memory of them was a persistent echo. He imagined the mites shadowing him, just beyond the reach of his light, waiting for his faith to waver, for his voice to fail. His prayers became a constant, desperate muttering, a shield of words against the encroaching darkness. He stumbled through the mire, his progress agonizingly slow. The roots seemed to grab at his ankles with a new, deliberate malice. The air grew colder, the humidity seeping into his bones. He did not know how long he walked. Time had no meaning here. There was only the circle of light, the oppressive darkness, and the fear. He was beginning to falter, his voice growing hoarse, his steps unsteady when he saw it. Another light. It was faint at first, a warm orange glow flickering in the distance. It was not the cold, sterile light of a flashlight. It was the light of a flame. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through him. Another person, a rescuer. He was not alone. "Hello," he shouted, his voice raw. "Is someone there? I need help." He plunged towards the light, his previous caution forgotten. He crashed through the undergrowth, shouting as he went. The light grew brighter, steadier. He could smell wood smoke and pitch. He burst through a final screen of hanging moss and stumbled into a small, dry patch of land, a tiny island in the sea of mud. In the center of the island stood a hovel, a crude shack built of driftwood, corrugated tin, and scavenged pieces of tarpaulin. A thin curl of smoke rose from a rusty pipe jutting from its roof. The orange light came from a lantern hanging from a hook by the door, and from a fire pit where a small blaze crackled merrily. A figure sat by the fire, his back to Julian. He was a wiry man dressed in patched canvas trousers and a filthy wool sweater despite the heat. Long, gray hair was tied back in a greasy ponytail. He did not move as Julian crashed into the clearing. He simply sat on a log, poking the fire with a long stick. "Help me," Julian gasped, falling to his knees. "Please, there are things in the woods, creatures." The man slowly turned his head. His face was a road map of wrinkles, his beard untrimmed and stained with what might have been tobacco. His eyes were small and bright, like a bird's, and they held no surprise. They looked Julian up and down, taking in his torn clothes, his mud-caked body, his wild-eyed terror. The man finally spoke, his voice a low rasp like stones grinding together. "Creatures, you say?" It was not a question. "Yes," Julian said, his words tumbling out. "Horrible things, they came out of the mud, they whispered." The man grunted. He turned back to the fire and jabbed it with his stick, sending a shower of sparks into the night air. "Things in the mud are the least of your worries. They're just scavengers, bottom feeders." He gestured with his stick towards the log opposite him. "Sit. You're stinking up my clearing with your fear." Julian, exhausted and confused, did as he was told. He sank onto the log, the warmth of the fire a blissful comfort against his chilled skin. He watched the man, who seemed completely at ease in this nightmare landscape. "Who are you?" Julian asked. "Call me Olin," the man rasped. He pointed the stick at Julian's chest. "The question is, who are you, and what are you doing in my swamp?" I'm Father Julian Finch." Olin let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh. "A priest, of course. It's always the priests or the politicians who wander in here looking for something they lost." He squinted at Julian, his gaze sharp and unsettlingly perceptive. "You didn't just stumble in here by accident, did you, priest? You came looking. You brought something with you, something they could smell." Julian stared at him, bewildered. "Smell? What are you talking about?" Olin leaned forward, the firelight casting deep shadows on his face. "This place," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is hungry. It feeds on sorrow, on guilt, on secrets." He tapped his temple with a grimy finger. "It feeds on what you carry around up here. Those little mud crawlers you met, they're nothing. They're like flies on a corpse. They're drawn to the rot." He looked directly into Julian's eyes. The hermit's gaze was so intense it felt like a physical intrusion. "You brought a feast with you, priest," Olin rasped, a grim finality in his tone. "They smelled it on you from a mile away." The last of Julian's strength left him. The hermit's words, the crackling fire, the oppressive darkness beyond the ring of light all swirled together. The clearing tilted, the sounds faded to a dull roar, and he pitched forward off the log into a welcoming, bottomless darkness. Chapter 4: The Hermit's Counsel. Julian woke to the smell of stew and the sharp, medicinal scent of pine sap. He was lying on a cot, a rough wool blanket pulled up to his chin. The light was dim, coming from a single lantern that cast flickering shadows across the interior of the hovel. He sat up, his muscles screaming in protest. His clothes were gone. He was wearing a large, coarse-spun shirt that smelled of wood smoke. His own clothes, washed and scrubbed, hung from a line strung across the small room, dripping onto the packed earth floor. The hovel was a single, cluttered space. Shelves made of driftwood were crammed with jars of preserved food, bundles of dried herbs, and strange objects carved from bone and wood. A small, pot-bellied stove in the corner radiated a gentle warmth. It was the dwelling of a man who wasted nothing. Olin sat at a small, rickety table, hunched over a steaming bowl. He did not look up as Julian stirred. He ate with a single-minded focus, scooping stew into his mouth with a wooden spoon. "You were out for most of the day," Olin said without turning around. "Screamed in your sleep. Something about a woman named Agnes." Julian swung his legs over the side of the cot. His body was a tapestry of scratches and deep bruises. On his calf, a crude poultice of green leaves and pine sap was bound with a strip of cloth. "There's stew on the stove," Olin grunted. "Eat it. You'll need your strength." Julian's stomach growled. He ladled some of the thick, dark stew into a chipped ceramic bowl and sat at the table opposite the hermit. It was made of unidentifiable meat and root vegetables, but it was hot and savory. He ate in silence for several minutes, the simple act of filling his stomach a profound comfort. "Those things, the mites," Julian finally said, his voice hesitant. "What were they?" Olin finished his bowl, scraping it clean with his spoon. "I told you, they're sin-eaters, scavengers. They're born from the mud when a strong enough scent passes by." He looked at Julian, his bird-like eyes seeming to pierce right through him. "That Agnes woman must have been a real piece of work. The stink of her confession was strong on you, drew them right out of the ground." "How is this possible?" Julian asked, his rational mind struggling for purchase. "It defies all logic, all science." Olin snorted, a sound of pure derision. "Your science and your logic don't mean much in here, priest. This is an older place. It runs on older rules. The mangrove doesn't care about your books or your God. It only cares about what hurts. It takes the pain, the guilt, the sorrow, and it eats. The weeping of the trees, that's it digesting." The image was so grotesque, so viscerally awful that Julian had to put his spoon down. "You live here. Why, how?" "I had my reasons," Olin said, his expression closing off. He held up his left hand. 3 fingers were missing, severed at the knuckle, the remaining stumps long-healed and scarred. "I came here to pay a debt. The mangrove accepted my payment. It lets me be, so long as I don't interfere with its meals." He gave Julian a pointed stare. "And so long as I don't help the meals escape." A cold dread settled in Julian's stomach, heavier than the stew. "I have to leave. Can you show me the way out?" "Out?" Olin let out his harsh, barking laugh again. "There is no out for you, priest. Not the way you came. The mangrove has your scent now. It's tasted you. The path you took to get here, it's gone. The trees will have moved. The waterways will have shifted. It will guide you in circles until you drop from exhaustion, and then it will feast on your despair." Julian stared at him, the full weight of his predicament crashing down. He was not just lost. He was trapped inside a predator. "So what do I do?" he whispered. "I just stay here and wait to be eaten." Olin stood and walked to the single, grimy window of the hovel. He wiped a patch of condensation from the glass and peered out into the gathering dusk. "There's one way. It's not out, it's through. You have to go to the heart. the place all the sorrow veins lead. The sorrow veins. The big roots, Olin said impatiently. The ones that glow, they pump all the misery to the center, to the pulpit. The pulpit, Julian's mind reeled. The language was a bizarre mix of swamp lore and twisted theology. The penitent's pulpit, the confession tree, whatever you want to call it. Olin turned from the window, his face grim in the lantern light. It's the brain of this place, its stomach. If you can get there and if you can face what it shows you, it might let you go. It might spit you out on the other side, or it might just swallow you whole. Julian felt a profound weariness settle over him. He had come here seeking a reckoning, and he had found one, but it was a far more literal and monstrous affair than he had ever imagined. Face what it shows me. What does that mean? Olin returned to the table and sat down, leaning in close. His breath was sour. The mites were an appetizer, priest. They were born from the sins you heard from others. Easy stuff. The mangrove saved the main course for itself. When you get closer to the heart, it won't use other people's filth. It will use yours. He tapped his own chest. It will take the worst thing you've ever done, the secret you've never told another living soul, the one that festers in you, the one that keeps you awake at night, and it will give it a body. It will make it real, and it will send it to hunt you. Julian's blood ran cold. He thought immediately, unwillingly, of Liam, his younger brother, the flicker of a memory, a sunny day, a picnic by the quarry, the impossibly blue water, Liam's laughing face, the dare, the splash, the silence that followed. He pushed the memory down, a reflexive action honed over 35 years, but it was too late. The image had surfaced. Olin saw the change in his expression. A flicker of something that might have been pity crossed the hermit's face. "Ah," he rasped, "there it is. I can see it. That's a deep one, an old one. That's what's been calling the mangrove to you all this time. The rest of it, that woman's confession, that was just ringing the dinner bell." Julian could not speak. He felt exposed, violated, as if the hermit had reached into his soul and pulled out his darkest secret. "So that's the choice," Olin said, standing up and stretching. "You can stay here. I've got enough food for a month, but the mangrove is patient. It will find a way in. It will send things to test the walls, to whisper through the cracks. Eventually, this little island of mine will sink, or you can walk to the heart. You can face your ghost, whatever it is. You win, you might walk out. You lose, you become part of the scenery." He gestured to the strange carvings on his shelves. Julian looked closer. One was a human hand carved from a mangrove root, its fingers contorted in agony. Another was a face, its features twisted in a silent scream, carved into a large piece of driftwood. Trophies, or warnings. The decision was no decision at all. To stay here was to slowly go mad, waiting for the end. To go forward was to face a terror he could barely comprehend, but it offered a sliver of a chance. "I'll go," Julian said, his voice barely a whisper. Olin nodded as if he expected it. "Tomorrow at dawn, get some rest. You'll hear things in the night, don't listen." As Olin spoke, a flicker of movement outside the window caught Julian's eye. It was small and pale. For a single, heart-stopping second, he saw the face of a young boy, his features indistinct, pressed against the glass. Then it was gone. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly on the floor. "What was that? Did you see it?" Olin didn't even turn to the window. "See what, priest?" There was a face, a boy's face, in the window. The hermit's expression hardened. "There's nothing out there but trees and mud. You're tired. Your mind is playing tricks on you." He turned his back on Julian and began to bank the fire in the stove for the night. "Get some sleep." Julian knew what he had seen. It wasn't a trick of the mind. Olin was wrong. The mangrove wasn't waiting for him to get to the heart. His ghost had already found him. Chapter 5: The Water's Memory. Julian did not sleep. He lay on the cot, every nerve alight, listening to the sounds of the hovel and the mangrove beyond. Olin snored softly from a hammock strung up in the darkest corner of the shack, a rhythmic, guttural sound that did little to comfort him. Outside, the night was alive. Julian could hear the soft, wet plops of things moving through the mud, the creak and groan of the weeping trees, and a low, almost subsonic hum that seemed to vibrate up through the earth and into his bones. It was the sound of the mangrove digesting. He stared into the darkness, the image of the boy's face at the window burned into his vision. Liam. It had been 35 years, but he would know that face anywhere. The wide, curious eyes, the small nose, the way his hair fell across his forehead. But the face in the window had been different. It was pale, waterlogged, and its expression was not one of youthful joy. It was empty, blank, the face of something that was merely wearing a memory. Dawn came not as a sunrise, but as a slow, gray dilution of the oppressive blackness. Olin was already awake, brewing a foul-smelling tea over the stove. He handed a mug of the bitter liquid to Julian. "Drink it," the hermit commanded. "It'll settle your stomach and sharpen your wits. You'll need both." Julian drank. The tea was hot and tasted of chicory and dirt. As he finished, Olin pushed a rusty machete into his hand. The wooden handle was smooth with use, the blade pitted but sharp. "For the vines," Olin said. "Don't try to fight anything bigger than a vine with it. You'll lose." He also handed Julian a small, clay jar sealed with beeswax. "Pine pitch. If you get cornered by the mites again, get a torch lit. They fear fire more than your prayers." They stood outside the hovel as the gray light filtered through the canopy. The air was thick with mist, making the trees seem like ghostly specters. Olin pointed with his three-fingered hand into the dense, shrouded woods. "Follow the sorrow veins, the big roots. They all lead to the pulpit. The ground will get softer the closer you get. The whispers will get louder." He paused, his bright eyes fixing on Julian. "And one last thing, priest. Don't trust the water, any of it. The puddles, the streams, the pools. It looks still, but it's not. The water in here, it remembers everything that's ever fallen into it." Without another word, Olin turned and went back inside his hovel, shutting the door with a solid thud. Julian was alone. He looked at the machete in his hand, then at the impenetrable wall of trees. Every instinct screamed at him to run back the way he came, but he knew the truth in Olin's words. There was no way back, only through. He took a deep breath, the humid air filling his lungs, and stepped off Olin's small island of solid ground and back into the mire. The journey was a descent into a deeper level of hell. The mangrove was more aggressive now, as if his presence had fully awakened its malevolent consciousness. The whispers started again, but they were different. They were not the sins of his parishioners. They were his own doubts, his own fears, given voice. Your faith is a lie. You are a hollow man. You let him die. The words slithered around him, spoken in his own voice. He tried to block them out with prayers, but his recitation was weak, faltering. He focused on his task, finding the thick, pulsing roots Olin had called sorrow veins and following them as they snaked through the mud. They were easy to spot. They were darker than the other roots and seemed to throb with a faint, internal rhythm, like diseased arteries. The fauna of the mangrove seemed to watch him pass. Small, dark crabs with patterns on their shells like human eyes swarmed over the roots, their claws clicking, their unblinking gaze following his every move. Once, a snake that he had mistaken for a root dropped from a branch in front of him. It hissed, its fangs dripping a milky venom before slithering away into the undergrowth. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. He came to a stagnant pool of black water, a clearing of sorts where the trees parted to reveal a mirror-like surface. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the gray, weeping branches above. He needed to get around it. As he skirted the edge, a ripple disturbed the center of the pool. He stopped, watching. Another ripple. Then he saw it. Beneath the surface, a face was looking up at him. It was Liam's face, pale and serene, his hair floating around his head like a halo. Julian's breath hitched in his throat. He stared, mesmerized. The face was not distorted by the water. It was perfectly clear, as if he were looking through a pane of glass. The eyes were open and they were fixed on him. Julian stumbled backward, tripping over a root and landing hard in the mud. He squeezed his eyes shut. "It's not real," he whispered, the words a desperate prayer. "It's a memory, it's the forest." When he opened his eyes and looked again, the face was gone. The water was a perfect, unbroken mirror once more. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing. A hallucination. It had to be. Olin's warning echoed in his mind. The water remembers. He pressed on, the machete held in a white-knuckled grip. The vision had shaken him to his core. It had brought the memory of the quarry back with a terrible, vivid clarity. The warmth of the sun on his face, the smell of cut grass from the picnic basket. Liam, all of 10 years old, skinny and fearless, daring him to a race across the quarry. Julian, 17 and arrogant, had been distracted by a pretty girl from town who had smiled at him. He had told Liam to wait, just a minute. But Liam never waited. The splash. By the time Julian turned, it was too late. He remembered the icy shock of the water as he dived in, the frantic, burning search in the murky depths. He remembered pulling his brother's limp, small body from the water. He remembered the silence. The terrible, accusing silence from his parents, from the town, from his own soul. It was the moment his faith began to crack, the moment the whispers started in his own head. He was so lost in the memory that he almost didn't see the causeway. The sorrow vein he was following plunged directly into a wide, shallow channel of water. The channel was perhaps 30 feet across, and a submerged bank of mud and roots seemed to offer a path to the other side. The water was waist-deep, stained the color of rust by the mangrove sap. There was no way around it. He had to cross. He hesitated at the water's edge, Olin's warning ringing in his ears. He took a tentative step in. The water was shockingly cold, a stark contrast to the humid air. The mud on the bottom sucked at his boots, trying to hold him in place. He took another step, then another, his eyes fixed on the far bank. He was halfway across, the water swirling around his waist when he felt it. A touch. It was on his ankle, small, cold fingers wrapping around his leg. He cried out, kicking his leg, but the grip was surprisingly strong. Another hand grabbed his other ankle. He looked down into the murky, red water. Two small, pale hands were holding him fast. He could see the faint, ghostly outline of a small body beneath the surface. Panic, absolute and blinding, seized him. He thrashed wildly, trying to break free. The machete flew from his grasp and disappeared into the water with a splash. The hands pulled, trying to drag him down, to pull him under the surface into the cold, suffocating embrace of the water. He saw the boy's form more clearly now. It was the drowned Echo, Liam's ghost, its eyes wide and empty, its mouth open in a silent, accusatory scream. It was not a memory anymore. It was real. It was here, and it was trying to kill him. With a surge of desperate strength, Julian lunged forward, dragging the immense weight with him. He clawed at the muddy bank, his fingers digging into the slick earth. The ghost pulled, its cold strength immense. For a horrible, eternal moment, he was caught, a tug of war between the world of the living and the memory of the dead. He roared, a sound of pure animal desperation, and gave one final, body-racking heave. He broke free. He scrambled up the bank, collapsing onto the mud, gasping for air, his body trembling uncontrollably. He rolled over and looked back at the channel. The water was perfectly still and silent. There was no sign of the ghost, no trace of the struggle. It was as if nothing had happened. Then he saw it. There on the dark mud beside where his hand had been was another print. It was the perfect, unmistakable shape of a small child's hand. As he watched, his breath caught in his throat, the handprint slowly, impossibly, filled with water and faded away into the mud. He was no longer being haunted. He was being hunted. Chapter 6: The False Clearing. The terror of the attack receded, leaving behind a residue of cold, granular certainty. Julian lay in the mud, his body a trembling wreck, but his mind was horrifyingly clear. The thing in the water was not a hallucination. It was not a metaphor. It was a hunter, and he was its prey. The mangrove had taken the deepest wound in his soul and given it hands to pull him down. Olin was right. This place would not just torment him with whispers. It would use his own history as a weapon, forging his grief into a blade to press against his throat. He pushed himself to his feet, his muscles screaming. His clothes were soaked with the cold, rust-colored water of the channel, and the fabric chafed against his skin. He had lost the machete, his one tool. He was armed with nothing now but a failing faith and a small clay jar of pine pitch. He looked at his hands. They were caked with mud, the fingernails broken and bleeding from his scramble up the bank. He was becoming as wild and ragged as the hermit he had left behind. He had to move. To stay still was to wait for the hunter to find him again. He located the sorrow vein on this side of the channel, a thick, gnarled root that pulsed with that same sickly, rhythmic beat. He began to follow it, his pace a shambling, exhausted parody of a walk. The world had narrowed to this single task: follow the route, survive the next step. The mangrove grew denser, more claustrophobic. The air became so heavy with moisture it felt like breathing water. The weeping trees bled more freely here, their crimson sap dripping from leaves and branches, staining the ground in glistening pools. The coppery smell was overpowering. He felt as if he were walking through the open veins of a dying behemoth. The whispers returned. Not his parishioners' sins, not his own self-doubt, but a single voice, clear and high-pitched. Liam's voice. "Julian, where did you go?" The sound was so real, so perfect, it stopped him in his tracks. He spun around, his eyes scanning the impenetrable wall of trees. There was nothing there. "You said you'd be right back, Julian." The voice came from his left. He turned, his heart hammering. Liam. The name was a cracked, desperate sound on his lips. "You were looking at her, the girl with the yellow ribbon in her hair. You weren't watching me." It was not a memory, it was an accusation. The voice was filled with a child's simple, devastating honesty. Julian pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, trying to block it out. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty forest. "I am so sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix it. The water is so cold, Julian." He stumbled away from the voice, breaking into a shambling run. He had to escape the words, the truth they carried. He ran blindly, no longer following the route, his only thought to put distance between himself and the voice of his dead brother. Branches whipped his face, thorns tore at his arms, but he didn't register the pain. He burst through a thicket of razor-edged sawgrass and fell, sprawling into a clearing. He lay there, gasping for breath, the words echoing in his skull. When he finally pushed himself up, he stared in disbelief. The clearing was beautiful. It was a perfect circle of lush, green grass, dappled with sunlight that seemed to be filtering down from an unseen sky. A gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and warm earth. In the center of the clearing was a pool of water, but it was not the black, stagnant water of the mangrove. This water was a brilliant, impossible blue, clear to the sandy bottom. It was the quarry. He was looking at the picnic spot from that day. He could almost see the checkered blanket, the wicker basket, the half-eaten sandwiches. It was a perfect, idyllic recreation of the last place he had been happy, the last moment before his life had fractured. The voice came again, but this time it was not an accusation. It was a gentle invitation. "Come on, Julian, it's okay. You can rest now. The water is warm." He saw him then, Liam, standing on the far side of the pool, ankle-deep in the crystalline water. He was not the pale, waterlogged ghost from the channel. He was the Liam of memory, 10 years old, grinning, his hair ruffled by the breeze. He was solid. He was real. A wave of emotion so powerful it buckled Julian's knees, washed over him. It was a tidal wave of grief, love, and a desperate, impossible hope. Tears streamed down his face. "Liam," he sobbed. "It's all right, Julian. I'm not mad anymore," the boy said, his voice filled with forgiveness. He held out a hand. "Come on, let's go for that swim. You promised." Julian took a step forward, then another. The soft grass felt wonderful beneath his ruined boots. The sunlight was warm on his face. This was it. This was the absolution he had been seeking. It was not a punishment but a reward, a chance to go back to fix it. He could walk into that water, take his brother's hand, and everything would be all right. The mangrove, the whispers, the 35 years of guilt, it would all be washed away. He reached the edge of the pool, his eyes locked on his brother's smiling face. The water looked so clean, so pure. He could just lie down in it and let the current take him. He could finally rest. He lifted his foot to step into the water. "Don't trust the water." Olin's voice, a harsh, gravelly intrusion in this perfect sanctuary. The memory of the hermit's warning was a splash of icy water on his face. He paused, his foot hovering over the pool's surface. He looked at Liam's smiling face. It was perfect, too perfect. The smile did not waver. The eyes, though they looked at him, seemed to look through him. It was a photograph, a perfectly rendered illusion. He looked down at his own reflection in the pool. A gaunt, wild-eyed man stared back at him, his face a mask of mud and despair. But in the reflection, behind his own image, the clearing was not sunny and green. It was a murky, gray swamp. The beautiful blue pool was a viscous pit of black mud. The reflection showed the truth. The grass beneath his feet was not grass. He looked down and saw it for what it was, a carpet of bright green algae growing on the surface of a sinkhole, the false clearing, a lie to trap him. He looked back at the boy. Liam's smile flickered. For a moment the grin widened into something unnatural, a predator's rictus. The forgiving eyes flashed with a cold, hungry light. "It's better this way, Julian," the boy's voice said, but now it was a flat, dead thing. "Just lie down. It will be over soon." Revulsion and a new, cold terror gave Julian strength. This was not his brother. This was the mangrove wearing his brother's face. It was using his deepest desire, the desire for forgiveness, as bait. "No," Julian said, his voice shaking. "You are not him." The smile vanished. The boy's face contorted, the skin seeming to melt and run, the features collapsing into a blank, pale mask of mud and sap. The inviting voice became a furious, inhuman shriek that echoed through the trees. The ground beneath Julian's feet trembled. The illusion shattered. The sunlight vanished, replaced by the oppressive gray canopy. The scent of honeysuckle became the stench of rot. The beautiful clearing was revealed to be a deep, bubbling mud pit, the surface covered in a deceptively solid-looking layer of algae. He was standing on a crumbling precipice at its edge. He scrambled backwards, away from the pit. The shriek from the mud-faced effigy intensified, a sound of pure, thwarted hunger. The mud at the edge of the pit began to churn, and thick, grasping tendrils of root and slime erupted from the surface, reaching for him. He turned and ran, plunging back into the thorny, weeping hell of the true mangrove. He did not look back. He could hear the shriek of the thwarted creature behind him, a sound that would haunt his nightmares for whatever remained of his life. He had escaped the trap, but the knowledge of its cruelty was a new and terrible wound. The mangrove was not just a mindless predator. It was intelligent. It was observant. And it was using his own love as its most vicious weapon. Chapter 7: The Blasphemous Choir. The escape from the false clearing left Julian utterly hollowed out. The physical exertion was nothing compared to the spiritual violation. He had looked upon the face of his deepest hope and seen it twist into a monster's snarl. The mangrove had taken a sacred memory and desecrated it, turning a shrine into a hunting blind. The act was so profoundly cruel, so intimate in its malice, that it extinguished the last embers of his hope. He was no longer a pilgrim seeking penance. He was just meat, running through a maze of teeth. He found a sorrow vein and began to follow it, his movements mechanical. His mind was a wasteland. The whispers of the drowned echo had ceased, but the silence was worse. It was a waiting silence, the quiet of a predator that knows its prey is cornered and exhausted. It was no longer a question of if it would attack again, but how. His journey took him into a part of the mangrove that felt older, sicker. The trees were larger here, their branches heavy with thick, gray moss that dangled like a hangman's noose. The ground became a treacherous soup, forcing him to climb over the massive, slick roots that formed a chaotic lattice above the mire. The weeping of the trees was constant, the air saturated with the smell of sap and decay. He became aware of a new sound, faint at first, then growing steadily louder. It was music. A wheezing, discordant melody played on what sounded like a massive, poorly tuned church organ. The sound was a grotesque parody of a hymn, a familiar tune twisted into something mournful and menacing. It seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing through the mist-shrouded trees. Julian stopped, balancing precariously on a large root. He looked up. The high branches were filled with birds. They were large and pale, with featherless, scaly skin that looked like old parchment. Their beaks were long and curved, and their eyes were milky white like the eyes of the blind. They were not singing. They were the source of the organ music, the sound emanating from their throats in a chorus of wheezing, multi-toned notes. As he watched, the organ music stopped. A new sound began. It was the sound of a congregation, hundreds of people whispering in the pews of a great cathedral. The sound was so vivid he could almost smell the incense and the old, polished wood of his own church. The whispering rose in volume and he could pick out words. His name, Father Finch, Julian the priest. The birds, the blasphemous choir, were mimicking the sounds of his life, twisting them into a judgment. The organ music of his faith was now a funeral dirge. The respectful whispers of his flock were now the accusatory murmurs of a mob. This was an attack on the last piece of his identity. He was not just a man named Julian. He was Father Julian. The priesthood was the armor he had worn against the guilt of his past, and now the mangrove was tearing it away from him. One of the birds, perched on a branch directly above him, swiveled its blind head and opened its beak. It did not make a sound. Instead, the voice of Cora Martinez, sharp and clear, issued from it. "Don't make me come looking for you, Father." Another bird spoke, this time in the voice of one of his oldest parishioners. "He seems so distant lately, don't you think?" A third mimicked the reedy, hateful voice of Agnes Gable. "A hollow man, filled with our filth." Julian clapped his hands over his ears, but the voices were everywhere. It was a cacophony of his failures, his anxieties, the doubts of his flock, all broadcast from the throats of these hideous, blind creatures. He slipped from the root, his boots plunging into the cold, deep mud below. The mud sucked at his legs, holding him fast up to his knees. He was trapped, a captive audience for this blasphemous sermon. He struggled, but his movements only wedged him deeper into the mire. The birds grew more agitated, their chorus of whispers rising to a frantic, mocking crescendo. He thought of Olin's parting gift, the clay jar. He fumbled in his pocket, his fingers closing around the small, cool container. He pulled it out, his hands shaking, and worked the beeswax seal with his thumb. The sharp, clean scent of pine pitch cut through the stench of the swamp. He needed a torch. He looked around wildly. A piece of dry, punky wood was caught in the roots of a nearby tree just out of his reach. He lunged for it, his body straining, the mud pulling at him. His fingers brushed against it. He lunged again, roaring with effort, and managed to grab it. It was a meter long, as thick as his arm. He tore a strip of cloth from the hem of his ruined shirt and wrapped it around one end of the wood. He uncorked the jar and poured the thick, sticky pitch over the cloth, his movements clumsy and desperate. Now he needed a flame. He had no matches, no lighter. He looked up at the birds, at the mangrove. "Is this all you have?" he screamed at them, his voice raw with defiance. Mockery, echoes. He was answered by a sound that was not a mimicry. It was a sharp, grating noise, like flint striking steel. One of the sorrow veins near him, a massive root pulsing with red light, began to spark. The psychic energy of this place, the sheer concentration of misery, was so potent it was becoming a physical force. Another spark flew, landing on a patch of dry moss and fizzling out. Julian saw his chance. He held the pitch-soaked torch towards the root, stretching his body to its limit. "Come on," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Come on." A bright spark leaped from the root and landed on the torch. The pitch ignited with a sudden, violent whoosh. A ball of bright orange flame erupted in the gray gloom, casting flickering shadows all around. The heat was intense, a welcome contrast to the cold mud. The birds shrieked, a true, natural sound of terror this time. They recoiled from the light and the heat. The chorus of whispers and organ music died instantly. With a frantic beating of featherless wings, the entire flock took flight, disappearing into the mist. Silent, blessed, absolute silence. Julian stood in the mud, holding the burning torch aloft like a beacon. The firelight danced on the weeping trees, making the dripping sap glisten like fresh blood. He felt a surge of triumph, the first positive emotion he had experienced since entering this nightmare. He was not just a victim. He could still fight back. He used the heat from the torch to warm the mud around his legs, making it softer, more pliable. With a final, agonizing effort, he pulled his legs free, collapsing onto the root system. He lay there for a long time, the torch propped up beside him, its light keeping the encroaching darkness at bay. When he finally found the strength to continue, he moved with a new purpose. The torch was a weapon, a shield. It cut through the mist and kept the smaller, unseen things of the mangrove at a distance. He followed the sorrow vein, which was now as thick as his own body, its pulsing more pronounced, a steady, sickening heartbeat. He walked for what felt like another hour, the world a small circle of firelight in an infinite darkness. Then he saw it. Through a gap in the trees, silhouetted against the murky gray sky, stood a structure. It was not a tree, not in the way he understood the word. It was a colossal, living edifice of fused mangrove roots, gnarled wood, and weeping bark. It rose from the swamp like a cancerous cathedral, its upper branches clawing at the sky. At its base was a massive, arching opening like the maw of some titanic beast. This was the source of the heartbeat, the destination of all the sorrow veins, the penitent's pulpit. His journey was almost over. The final test was at hand. He took a step towards it, his torch held high. And then he froze. Standing in the archway blocking his path was a figure. It was small, indistinct at first, a silhouette against the deep gloom within the pulpit. As Julian moved closer, the torchlight fell upon it and his blood turned to ice. It was the boy, the drowned echo, Liam. He was not a reflection in the water or a fleeting vision in a clearing. He was standing there, solid and real, dripping with cold quarry water that sizzled where it hit the muddy ground. His clothes were the same ones he had worn that day, 35 years ago. His eyes were open and they were fixed on Julian. They held no anger, no forgiveness. They held nothing at all but a profound, endless emptiness. He was waiting for him. Chapter 8. The Penitent's Pulpit. The sight of the boy, standing so still and solid, was a physical blow. Julian's breath caught in his chest, and the torch in his hand wavered, its light dancing across the pale, dripping form. This was not an illusion to be broken, not a whisper to be ignored. This was the final guardian. The mangrove had distilled 35 years of guilt into this single, silent sentinel. Julian took a hesitant step forward. The drowned echo did not move. It simply watched him, its empty eyes a mirror for the hollowness in Julian's own soul. The air grew thick and cold, and the rhythmic pulsing from the pulpit intensified, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in Julian's teeth. He was standing at the threshold of the mangrove's heart, and it was using his deepest wound to deny him entry. "Liam," Julian whispered. The name felt like a shard of glass in his throat. The echo did not respond. It just stood there, the water from its clothes forming a dark, spreading puddle at its feet. The silence was more terrifying than any shriek or accusation. It was the silence of the quarry depths, the silence of a stopped heart. Julian knew he could not force his way past. The thought of touching that cold form, of pushing it aside, was an unimaginable violation. This was not a battle of strength. It was a trial. He had to face this. He had to walk through this fire. He took another step, then another, until he was only a few yards away. He could see the small details now. The way his brother's dark hair was plastered to his forehead, the goosebumps on his pale arms, the small scrape on his knee from where he'd fallen off his bike the day before. The mangrove's cruelty was in its precision. "I came here for a reckoning," Julian said, his voice shaking but clear. He was not speaking to the mangrove anymore. He was speaking to the memory. "I suppose this is it." As he spoke, the world dissolved. The mangrove, the mud, the torch in his hand, it all faded away. He was standing on the warm granite ledge of the quarry. The sun was hot on his shoulders. He could hear the drone of bees and the distant laughter of other families. He turned and saw himself, a gangly, arrogant 17-year-old trying to catch the eye of a girl in a yellow sundress. And there, at the edge of the water, was Liam skipping stones across the surface. He was not an observer, he was there. He lived the moment again, a helpless passenger in his own body. He felt the flash of annoyance as Liam called his name, pulling his attention away from the girl. He heard his own dismissive words. "Just a minute, Squirt. Wait for me." He watched Liam's shoulders slump in disappointment. He watched him turn back to the water. He watched as the boy, in an act of childish defiance, took a running start and jumped. The splash was small, too small. Then the vision shifted. The world warped, the sounds muffled as if he were underwater. He was no longer on the ledge. He was beneath the surface, looking up at the shimmering, sunlit ceiling of the water. He was seeing through Liam's eyes. He felt the shock of the cold, the desperate, burning need for air. He saw his own legs kicking frantically, his small body fighting against the weight of the water, against the pull of the deep. He saw the light above begin to fade. He felt the last of the air leave his lungs in a stream of silver bubbles. Then there was only darkness and a crushing, cold silence. Julian screamed, collapsing to his knees in the mud. He was back in the mangrove, the torch lying beside him, its flame sputtering. The vision had been more real than any memory. He had felt his brother's last moments. He had drowned with him. He looked up. The drowned echo was closer now, standing directly over him. It reached out a small, cold hand. Julian flinched, but the hand did not try to grab him. It gently touched his forehead. Another vision. He was standing in his parents' kitchen. The air was thick with a grief so profound it was a physical presence. His mother sat at the table, staring at a single, empty plate. His father stood at the window, his back to the room, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Julian, the 17-year-old survivor, stood in the doorway, wanting to say something, anything, but his throat was locked. He saw the look his mother gave him. It was not hatred. It was worse. It was a look of utter desolation, as if she were looking at a ghost who had brought back the wrong son. He felt their silent, unspoken blame, a weight that would settle on his soul and never leave. The vision faded. Julian was on his hands and knees, weeping, the sounds torn from the deepest part of him. He was not just crying for Liam. He was crying for his parents, for the family that had died that day as surely as his brother had. He was crying for the boy he had been, who had buried his guilt under 35 years of piety and ritual. This was the heart of it. This was the judgment. The mangrove was showing him the full scope of his sin, the ripples of pain that had spread from that single moment of selfish distraction. He looked up at the drowned echo, its pale face inches from his own. The empty eyes seemed to hold all the sorrow in the world. He knew what he had to do. His faith had been a shield, a way to hide from this moment. Prayer had been a way to ask for a forgiveness he did not deserve. The only thing left was the truth, the confession, not to God, to Liam. "It was my fault," Julian said, the words scraping his raw throat. He met the ghost's empty gaze. "It was all my fault. You told me to watch and I didn't. I was thinking about myself. I was selfish and arrogant and you paid for it." He took a shuddering breath, the act of speaking the truth a physical agony. "I let you die, Liam. I am sorry. I am so, so sorry. I should have been watching you." He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not plead for salvation. He simply stated the truth, a pure, unadorned confession of his guilt. He offered it up to the ghost, to the mangrove, to the universe. It was the heaviest thing he had ever carried, and he finally put it down. He expected the ghost to strike, to finally pull him down into the cold darkness he deserved. But it did not. A change came over the drowned echo. The profound emptiness in its eyes softened. The rigid set of its small body relaxed. It was a subtle shift, but it was unmistakable. The manifestation, a creature born of guilt and accusation, was being starved of its purpose. Julian's acceptance, his pure confession without expectation of relief, was a language it understood. It was the end of the argument. The boy's form began to grow translucent. He was no longer a solid presence, but a shimmering outline of memory and mist. He raised his hand from Julian's forehead, and for the first time his expression changed. A faint, sad smile touched the corners of his lips. It was a smile of release, of farewell. Then he was gone. The oppressive psychic pressure that had been crushing Julian vanished in an instant. The deep, rhythmic thrumming of the pulpit ceased. The whispers were gone. The air, for the first time since he had entered the mangrove, was just air. The trees were just trees. Julian remained on his knees, utterly spent. He felt scoured clean, but not in the way he had expected. There was no divine light, no feeling of grace. There was only a vast, quiet emptiness. The wound in his soul was still there, but it was no longer festering. He had looked into its depths and owned it. He pushed himself to his feet, his body an aching, exhausted ruin. He picked up the torch. Its flame was burning low. He looked at the penitent's pulpit. The great arching maw was no longer menacing. It was just an opening, a passage. He had faced its guardian and survived. With the last of his strength, Julian Finch, the priest who had lost his faith and found a terrible, quiet truth instead, stumbled forward and walked into the heart of the weeping mangrove. Chapter 9: Heartwood. The interior of the penitent's pulpit was a vast, cathedral-like cavern formed from the fused heartwood of 1,000 ancient trees. The air within was surprisingly dry and still, carrying the scent of old wood, dry earth, and a faint, ozone tang of spent energy. The ground was not mud, but a soft, springy floor of compressed peat and fallen leaves, accumulated over centuries. The only light came from Julian's sputtering torch and a faint, ambient luminescence that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a pale, phosphorescent glow that revealed the intricate, gnarled patterns of the wood. The walls were a tapestry of faces, knots and burls that had twisted over time into expressions of sorrow, agony, and a profound, silent resignation. He was standing inside the mangrove's memory, surrounded by the echoes of every creature it had ever consumed. There was no sense of menace here. The raw, predatory hunger of the outer mangrove was absent. In its place was a deep, abiding melancholy, the accumulated sorrow of millennia. The pulsing heartbeat was gone. The whispers were silent. He had passed the trial, and the sanctum had granted him entry. He walked deeper into the cavern, his footsteps muffled by the peat. The cavern narrowed into a single, wide passage. The sorrow veins, the thick, pulsing roots he had followed, all converged here, terminating at the far end of the passage. They snaked across the floor and up the walls, their dark, arterial forms looking inert and drained, their sickly inner light extinguished. At the end of the passage, in the very center of the pulpit's heart, stood a single, slender tree. It was utterly unlike the gnarled, weeping mangroves outside. Its bark was a smooth, bone white, and it had no leaves. Its branches were thin and delicate, reaching upwards like supplicating arms. It did not glow or pulse, it simply was. Around its base, the peat floor was clear, and a small pool of water had collected, perfectly clear and still. This was the source, the origin point of the entire forest's consciousness. The Dryad's heartwood, as Olin might have called it. Julian approached it, his exhaustion a heavy cloak on his shoulders. He felt no fear, only a profound weariness. He had faced his demon, and there was nothing left for the mangrove to use against him. He was an empty vessel, scoured clean by his own truth. As he drew near the white tree, he saw something at its base. Lying half submerged in the clear water of the pool was a skeleton. It was small, clad in the rotted, tattered remains of 18th-century clothing. A leather satchel, remarkably preserved by the tannin-rich water, lay beside it. He recognized the figure from the local historical society's records. It was Father Thomas, a missionary priest who had come to this area in the 1700s to convert the native tribes. His journal had been found at the edge of the swamp, detailing his attempts to preach to the heathens who worshipped the forest. The final entries spoke of a ritual, a dark pact, and his decision to enter the mangrove to confront the demon within. He was never seen again. Julian knelt by the pool, his torch casting flickering light on the scene. He understood. Father Thomas had come here just as he had. He had faced the mangrove's judgment, but he had not survived. His faith, rigid and unyielding, had likely been his undoing. He would have tried to fight the manifestations with prayer and exorcism, seeing them as external evils, never recognizing them as reflections of his own soul. He had fought the battle, but on the wrong terms. Julian reached into the water and gently touched the leather satchel. The moment his fingers made contact, a final vision flooded his mind. It was not his own memory. It was the mangroves. He saw the forest as it once was, vibrant and green, a place of life, not sorrow. He saw the native people who lived with it, who respected its power. He saw their rituals, their offerings of gratitude. Then he saw the arrival of the first Europeans. He witnessed the disease, the violence, the felling of trees. He felt the forest's confusion and pain as its symbiotic partners, the people who understood it, were wiped out. Then he saw Father Thomas, a man of fierce, burning faith, standing before the heartwood. The priest was shouting, holding his crucifix aloft, damning the ancient spirit of the wood as a demon. He was performing an exorcism on a god he did not understand. The vision was filled with the priest's righteous certainty, his absolute conviction in his own truth. And he felt the mangrove's response, a deep, profound sorrow at being misunderstood, at being hated by this new human who could not see its soul. The mangrove had not been born evil. It had been driven mad by grief. Father Thomas's aggressive piety had been the final blow. The forest, in its sorrow, had mirrored the priest's own rigid judgment back at him, and it had broken him. The weeping had begun then, the forest turning its grief outward, learning to feed on the sorrow of others because its own was too great to bear. The vision faded, leaving Julian with a final, aching truth. The mangrove was not a monster. It was a victim, a wounded god lashing out in pain. He looked from the skeleton of the priest to the serene, white tree. His journey had been an act of penance, but perhaps it was also an act of healing, not just for him, but for this place. By facing his own sorrow directly, by offering a confession without demanding forgiveness, he had done what Father Thomas could not. He had shown the mangrove a different way. He had offered it a moment of quiet empathy instead of loud condemnation. The flame of his torch finally died, sputtering out into a wisp of smoke. He was left in the pale, quiet luminescence of the Heartwood cavern. He was not afraid of the dark. He knew what he needed to do. It was not a prayer, not a ritual, not an absolution. It was a simple act of respect. He reached down and gently closed the skeleton's jaw, which had been hanging open in a silent scream. He arranged the bones with a quiet reverence, a priest finally laying a soul to rest. Then he stood, faced the white tree, and bowed his head. He said nothing. He simply stood in silent communion, a man who had confronted his own brokenness in the presence of a broken God. After a long time, he turned. On the far side of the cavern, a new passage had opened, a tunnel of woven roots that had not been there before. It was suffused with a faint gray light, the light of the outside world. The mangrove was showing him the way out. It was letting him go. He gave one last look at the white tree and the remains of the priest who had come before him. He felt a strange kinship with the man, two priests who had journeyed into a dark wood to face the nature of sin. One had been broken by his certainty. The other, perhaps, had been saved by his doubt. Julian Finch walked into the tunnel, leaving the heart of the mangrove to its ancient, quiet sorrow. He did not look back. Chapter 10: The Weight of Knowing. The tunnel was a gentle, sloping passage that felt like a throat, swallowing him from the dark heart of the mangrove and birthing him back into the world. The roots were smooth and dry, and the gray light ahead grew steadily brighter. He emerged from the opening not into the dense, menacing swamp, but into a quiet stand of cypress and pine at the far edge of the wetlands, miles from where he had entered. The air was clean and cool, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. He could hear the distant sound of a truck on a highway. He was free. He stood there for a long moment, a strange, spectral figure in his torn, mud-caked clothes. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple. It was the first sunset he had seen in what felt like a lifetime. The sheer, simple beauty of it was overwhelming. He was alive. He had survived. But the man who walked out of the mangrove was not the same one who had walked in. The Julian Finch who had entered the weeping mangrove was a man collapsing under the weight of other people's sins. The man who emerged carried only one, his own. But it was a weight he now knew how to bear. He had looked it in the face, felt its last moments, and spoken its truth. It was no longer a festering wound hidden in darkness, but a clean, honest scar. It would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He began to walk, his body moving on autopilot towards the sound of the highway. He was found an hour later by a trucker, a gaunt, silent figure walking along the shoulder of the road. The man, seeing his state, had given him a bottle of water and a ride back to town without asking a single question. When he arrived at the rectory, the first person he saw was Cora Martinez. Her patrol car was parked in the driveway, and she was standing on the porch, her arms crossed, her face a mask of worry and anger. 2 days, she said, her voice tight. 2 days you've been gone. I was about to organize a full-scale search, drag the damn National Guard in here." Her eyes scanned him, taking in his ruined clothes, the scratches on his face, the profound exhaustion in his eyes. Her anger seemed to evaporate, replaced by a deep human concern. "My God, Julian, what happened to you?" He looked at her, the pragmatic, logical woman who would never believe the truth. "I got lost," he said. The words were true enough. "I went for a walk. I got turned around." She did not look convinced, but she nodded, accepting the lie for what it was, a wall he needed to put up. "All right, Father, you're back. That's what matters." She hesitated. "You look different." "I am," he said quietly. In the days that followed, the town buzzed with gossip. Father Finch had suffered a breakdown, he'd gotten lost, he'd had a crisis of faith. He let them talk. He performed his duties with a quiet, steady resolve. He presided over Sunday Mass, his voice clear and strong. He met with the bake sale committee. He listened to Martha's concerns about the church roof. He performed the rituals and duties of his office, but something fundamental had changed. The next time he sat in the confessional, the darkness felt different. It was no longer a suffocating space where he absorbed the sins of others. It was just a quiet room. A man came in, his voice a troubled whisper, and confessed to cheating on his wife. Julian listened, but he no longer felt the sin transferring to him. He did not absorb the man's guilt. He simply heard his pain. He offered counsel, not as a holy vessel of God's law, but as one broken person speaking to another. He spoke of the need for honesty, of the courage it takes to face the harm you've done. He offered no easy absolution, no magic words to wipe the slate clean. He offered only the hard, quiet truth of living with your own choices. The man left the confessional not with the false lightness of a lifted burden, but with the heavy, necessary resolve to fix what he had broken. Julian had learned the mangrove's most profound lesson. A sin isn't a stain to be washed away, but a wound to be acknowledged. Hiding it lets it fester and become monstrous. Only by facing it, by owning it, can it ever truly begin to heal. He never went near the weeping mangrove again, but he knew it was there. He would see its dark, jagged line on the horizon and feel a strange sense of quiet kinship. He carried its knowledge within him. He knew that the world was filled with quiet, hungry places that fed on sorrow, and that the greatest monsters were the ones we carry inside ourselves. Sometimes, late at night in the sterile silence of the rectory, he would think of Olin, the hermit who had found a way to coexist with the darkness. He would think of the drowned echo, the sad, lonely ghost of his brother, finally at peace. And he would think of the mangrove itself, the wounded god, weeping its endless tears of blood-red sap into the mud. His journey had not saved his faith, but it had, in a strange and terrible way, saved his soul. He was a priest who now understood the true nature of confession, and he would carry that weight, and that alone, for the rest of his days. The end.